Hey everyone. Tonight, we're taking a calm, muddy little journey back in time to a place where the sky rumbled, the ground smelled faintly of death and cigarette smoke, and everyone desperately hoped their socks would dry before morning. That's right, we're going to the trenches. So, dim your lights, lay back, and imagine you're 19 years old, wearing wool that hasn't been washed in 3 months, and someone just told you that this war would be over by Christmas. It's July 1916. Spoiler alert, it won't be over by Christmas. Let's begin with a gentle shuffle into Europe in 1914, a continent that looked calm on the surface, but underneath, it was basically one big aristocratic family feud waiting to explode. Everyone was related, literally. You had Kaiser Wilhelm II of Germany, King George V of Britain, and Tsar Nicholas II of Russia. 3 cousins, all grandsons of Queen Victoria. Imagine if your family Thanksgiving argument caused a global war. That's roughly the level of energy we're dealing with here. Of course, they didn't mean to start the most catastrophic conflict in human history. Up to that point, they just sort of stumbled into it. Because when you give monarchs too many armies and not enough therapy, things happen. Anyway, fast forward a few months, and young men from every corner of Europe were cheerfully marching off to war. Posters promised glory, honor, and adventure. The reality? Mud. Endless, sticky, soul-sucking mud. Now let's talk about that mud, because it deserves its own paragraph. When you picture a battlefield, you might imagine soldiers charging dramatically through open fields. But in World War I, most of the battlefield was a network of long, narrow trenches dug into the ground, stretching from the North Sea all the way to Switzerland. That's roughly 475 miles of, well, glorified ditches. Trenches weren't straight. They zigzagged like a drunk snake, designed that way so that if an enemy got inside, they couldn't just shoot everyone in a straight line. Smart, but it also meant you could get lost trying to find the latrine. These trenches had layers, a front line, a support trench, and a reserve trench, connected by little communication tunnels. It sounds organized, and in theory it was. In reality, it was chaos. You'd sink up to your knees in water, rats the size of cats would race along the walls, and the smell, oh, the smell. Rotting flesh, gunpowder, moldy bread, wet wool, and the faint aroma of despair. Let's float over for a moment to the Western Front, that charming stretch of land where most of the nightmare happened. This is where British, French, and later American soldiers stared across a few hundred yards of open land at German soldiers doing the exact same thing. That few hundred yards was known as no man's land, and trust me, no one wanted to be there. It was a cratered wasteland of mud, barbed wire, and bodies. During battles, soldiers would be ordered to climb over the top, meaning leave the trench and run straight into machine gun fire. It's the kind of tactical brilliance that made generals very famous, and soldiers very dead. But between battles, things were quieter. Too quiet, actually. Imagine sitting in a ditch for weeks, doing nothing but waiting, cleaning your rifle and writing letters home like, "Dear Mother, still alive. Feet still damp. Please send socks." Ah, yes, socks. The unsung heroes of trench survival. Trench foot was the soldier's eternal enemy, a gruesome condition caused by standing in cold, wet mud for too long. Your feet would swell, blister, and sometimes turn black and fall off. It was sort of like frostbite's grosser cousin. To prevent it, soldiers were told to change socks several times a day, Of course, that was adorable in theory, but when everything you owned was soaked, dry socks were more of a fantasy concept. There's even a famous quote from one British soldier who said, "If you haven't been in the trenches, you can't imagine what it's like. If you have, you don't want to remember." That about sums it up. Let's talk about rats. They thrived in the trenches, feeding on discarded food and the occasional corpse. Soldiers would try to kill them, clubbing, stabbing, even shooting them. But for every rat you got, 100 more came to the funeral. There are accounts of rats growing so bold they'd crawl over sleeping soldiers. One man wrote that he woke up to find one nibbling on his ear. He probably didn't sleep too well after that. And if that wasn't enough, there were lice. Tiny, relentless little vampires that infested every piece of clothing. They caused constant itching, rashes, and a lovely disease called trench fever, which made you feel like you were dying, but slowly, and without the satisfaction of actually dying. Now, to keep morale up, soldiers relied on gallows humor, dark, sarcastic jokes about their situation. It was the only way to stay sane. They gave nicknames to everything. The daily artillery bombardments were called morning hate. A particularly muddy stretch of land might earn the title Suicide Corner. And when the rations arrived, often cold beans or bully beef, they joked that the Army's real goal was to kill them with the food first. Speaking of food, let's just say it was uninspiring. British soldiers lived on tinned beef, hard biscuits, and tea. French soldiers got wine and bread, so slightly better. And German soldiers had black bread, sausage, and cabbage, until the blockade kicked in and even that ran out. One soldier wrote home saying, "We eat to live, not to enjoy." Very poetic, very depressing, very on brand for 1916. At night, things got eerie. The world would go quiet, just the soft hum of distant artillery, the buzz of flies, and maybe a muffled cough from the next trench over. Men would whisper, play cards, smoke, or stare into the darkness, wondering if they'd see morning. There were stand-to times, just before dawn and dusk, when everyone had to be alert in case of surprise attacks. So, right when you wanted to sleep the most, that's when you stood shivering, waiting for nothing to happen. And yet, somehow, they found ways to live. They decorated their dugouts with photos of loved ones. They carved little trinkets out of shell casings. They wrote poetry. Yes, poetry. In between shellfire and misery. People like Wilfred Owen and Siegfried Sassoon turned their trauma into hauntingly beautiful verses. Lines like, "My friend, you would not tell with such high zest to children ardent for some desperate glory, remind us how the soldiers saw the war, not as noble, but as absurd." Let's drift for a moment into one of those quiet truces, the strange, almost dreamlike pauses in fighting. The most famous one happened on Christmas 1914. All along parts of the Western Front, British and German soldiers slowly stopped shooting at each other. They sang carols across no man's land. Silent Night, in 2 languages. Then, unbelievably, they climbed out of the trenches, met in the middle, and shook hands. They exchanged gifts, chocolate, tobacco, buttons. Some even played soccer on the frozen mud. For one day, they were just men again, not enemies. Of course, the generals weren't thrilled. You can't have peace breaking out in the middle of your war, after all. So by the next year, anyone attempting a truce was threatened with punishment, because nothing ruins a good war like basic human decency. Now, let's be clear, not every soldier hated it. Some adapted frighteningly well. Routine became comfort. When every day looked the same, the monotony itself was soothing.
You learn to find peace in repetition, cleaning your rifle, writing letters, brewing tea in a helmet. Others, of course, broke down. Shell shock, as it was called then, was common. Trembling hands, vacant stares, sudden tears. Today, we'd call it PTSD. Back then, they just sent you back after a rest, or sometimes, tragically, punished you for cowardice. It's easy to forget how little people understood mental trauma in 1916. There were no counselors, no medication, just the expectation that a man be strong. But strength has limits. By now, you might be wondering, why didn't they just stop? Well, because orders were orders, and the generals, sitting miles behind the lines, kept insisting that the next big push would win the war. The Battle of the Somme, Verdun, Passchendaele, each one promised victory, each one delivered mass graves. At the Somme alone, on the first day, Britain lost nearly 60,000 men in one day. And yet the lines barely moved. It's said that World War I was a war of inches. Men died for a few yards
Of mud. Whole battalions vanished to gain ground you could walk across in 30 seconds. It's almost poetic, if it weren't so utterly pointless. As months turned into years, the trenches became grim little worlds of their own. There were trench barbers, trench cooks, even trench pets. Some soldiers adopted stray dogs who deliver messages between lines. Others kept frogs or birds just for company. One man had a pet duck named Gertrude. No record if she survived, but I like to imagine she made it home and lived a long, happy life, far away from barbed wire. And yet, despite everything, camaraderie grew strong. Men from every background lived shoulder to shoulder, facing the same mud, same fear, same terrible coffee. They formed bonds that outlasted the war itself. Many veterans later said they never again felt such a deep sense of belonging, even though that belonging was forged in hell. And so, the war dragged on, endlessly, pointlessly, like a nightmare that refused to wake up. By 1918, the world was exhausted. Armistice finally came, the guns went silent, and millions of soldiers crawled out of their trenches, blinking into the pale November light. They called it the war to end all wars. It wasn't, of course, but for that brief, quiet moment, the survivors could almost believe it. Let's pause here for a breath. In Part 2, we'll sink deeper into the daily mental life of the trench, the superstitions, letters home, weird medical experiments, and how entire generations carried that silence long after the mud dried. So, stay cozy, and we'll continue this slow crawl through the war that no one could escape, not even in their dreams.